I'm here again with Dr. Coleman, but don't worry if you missed our last one because this is going to be a standalone episode with amazing content on family estrangement and hopefully some answers that are going to help you out and some new ways to look at it. So, Dr.
Sure.
Coleman, jumping right in, this is something I've been interested about. Is there a parenting style in your years of experience that you've noticed is the most connected to kids later on estranging, to future estrangement?
I mean, in general, I would say no. I mean, certainly, on the one hand, it would be easy to say, that, well, sure, parents were really abusive and molest their children and beat their children and neglect them, maybe at more risk. But I don't even know that we know that yet, because I don't
Mm,
know that even those kids often, because they're so desperate to still have some kind of a connection with their parents, may
mhm,
not estrange them later in life, or may even be more forgiving because of that. So
right.
I don't necessarily know that there's a particular parenting style that increases it. But I think once people become adults, if parents can't make the transition to learning how to talk in a more psychological, kind of a therapeutic way, I think that
Right.
increases the risk. So I think that's, if anything is going to decrease estrangements in the future, it's going to be because the next generation of parents know how to communicate about these things in ways that, boomers and Xers may not have known as well. So,
Right.
you know, so, so for those parents who don't know how to communicate through these things, they're more at risk for sure.
Right. Very well
Yeah.
said. Something I dug into the research a little bit, and it looks like, as far as parenting goes, low warmth, high control parenting has pretty bad outcomes. Just, I think, for relationship and for functioning and autonomy, supportive,
For
warm
sure.
parenting is best. So, I mean, we know
Yeah.
that already.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I think one of the things to highlight is that, I talk a lot about some of the dangers of helicopter parenting, but the research is also that in many ways those kids tend to do better and may in fact be closer to their parents later in life because the parents have been more psychological and involved and dedicated. But the downside to that is that parents have also become much more anxious, much more intrusive. And so a certain percentage of estrangements happen because the adult child just doesn't know any other way to feel separate from the
mhm.
parent. So it's a good news, bad news thing, like so much of our field.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's a lot of context there. But I mean, if it's, I would wonder if estrangements like that, where kids don't have the emotional vocabulary yet to know what almost like pseudo independence, just cut off, right? Versus healthy
Yeah.
independence, which says, okay, I respect you and I can talk to you, but I'm not going to defer in the same way. I wonder if that's associated with them coming back later, if it's just this fear of being engulfed, this fear of losing independence and needing to do something hasty to claim.
Well, I think so. Yeah, no, I think so. I think a certain percentage of estrangements happen because the adult child just doesn't know either how to feel separate from the parent. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
like, in the old days, like when I was coming up, there wasn't cell phones. When I moved out from Dayton, Ohio to San Francisco, and I wasn't like I wasn't texting my parent, I wasn't sending them
Mhm.
pictures. Maybe I called them collect 2 weeks later. So I think
Mhm.
that cell phones and the way that parenting has just become childhood moving indoors, parents are becoming much more anxious. It's created this kind of hothouse environment where children in some ways get too much of their parents. And so a certain percentage of estrangements do happen because the adult child just doesn't know any other way to feel separate from the parent. And in part because the parent, their expectations for closeness are much higher because, again, in my parents' day, my mother was playing mahjong with her girlfriends, and, my dad was, golf or squash on the weekends at the Y, and
Yeah.
they weren't worried about whether or not we felt neglected or, they weren't really trying to care that much about whether we thought they were great parents. They kind of had their
Mhm.
own lives, they had their hobbies. Whereas parents in the past 3 or 4 decades, it's all gotten removed from even friends and social lives and hobbies. This is what Robert Putnam talks about, you know,
Yeah.
and it all got kind of sucked into the nuclear family and redistributed to the children. And as a result, yeah, the good news is that children have gotten a lot more, but sometimes they've gotten more than they needed or even wanted, and that creates its own problems, tragically.
Wow. No, it's such an interconnected puzzle. I think the best psychology takes account of biology and sociology. And right now
For
you're talking
sure.
about just that societal sociology of, for whatever reason, and I've noticed this with men, by the way, this really dovetails nicely with kind of male culture. Like, I grew up watching reruns of the Flintstones and
Sure.
things like the I Love Lucy and maybe to a lesser extent the Honeymooners. I didn't really watch that one, but Nick at Night basically. Millennial Nick at Night stuff is like legendary. We grew up with that. And you would see the men going to bowling leagues or Fred with the Grand Poobah
Right,
Lodge, which didn't make sense to me because I didn't really know that kind of stuff as a kid. Like, oh, that's like the Masons or something. But this whole
right.
culture of men doing something between getting off work and dinner and bonding has evaporated to such an extent. Even in church culture for Christians, it's like, okay, if you're going to do a men's group, you do it at
Agreed.
7 a.m. So I'm just wondering what led to that. I don't expect you to be able to answer that or me, but it just, if you have any thoughts on that, I mean, yeah, shift to the nuclear family, but when did it become bad to say, let's show our kids that as an adult you can live a healthy social life?
No, I could discuss it because I think the explanation is economic, that in the
Oh, here
period.
we go.
Yeah, right. Because in the period between 1945 and the late 1970s, there was incredible investment by government and businesses in the family. Business taxes on businesses were something like 90, and so you have this huge increase of poor and Black families really getting brought up into the middle class. There was an enormous expansion of the middle class during that post-war period because there's enormous investment of it during the Reagan era and the Maggie Thatcher era, and as a result of Milton Friedman, economics, neoliberal policy, all of that got pulled away. And it's what the political scientist Jacob Hacker describes as the great risk shift. There was a shift of risk off of governments and businesses who had helped parents, with good paying union jobs, low cost college tuition, college loans, college grants, long term pensions, et cetera. And all that got eviscerated. And so children, parents couldn't really rely on government or businesses to help them. So they kind of had to give up all this stuff. So
Yeah,
I'm always getting annoyed when people go, "Oh, you shouldn't be a helicopter parent." Well, it's like in countries with high social inequality, like the US, China, and England, parents have to be
right.
helicopter parents because nobody else is looking out for their kids in the way that they are like in North America, Northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, Japan, et cetera. The governments are still and businesses are still involved in helping families, but the U.S. is like, no, screw you, you're on your own, parent, and that's why there's been that shift.
Mm, yes, that deserves a lot more attention, I think, than it gets, and a lot more empathy for the parents. I mean, some
Yeah,
parents have to
exactly.
choose, like if a spouse goes to work, I've heard this plenty of times. If they're not going to reach a certain amount of earnings, that spouse might as well stay home and watch the kids rather than hemorrhage that money to daycare.
Yeah, exactly.
What a choice. Okay.
Right. Well, so and as a result, I mean, so parents have become much more worried about their kids getting through the narrow bottleneck into an adult life. And so now career mothers spend more time with their children than stay-at-home mothers did in the 1960s. So there's been this,
Mhm.
huge investment in children, which again, it's a good news, bad news thing.
Yes, yes. Okay. So another question, speaking of raising kids and the changing demographics and times, have you noticed a difference in the rationale for cutoffs and estrangement based on generational cohorts? So for listeners, Gen X cutting off their parents, Gen Y, which we're more known as millennials, that name took. And then back to the Gen names, Gen Z. So I think Gen Alpha is too young to cut off, right? They're in their teens. They kind of need the parents for maybe 2 more years or so.
Yeah, and then
Um,
they'll do it. Yeah. The way
Hopefully not. I mean, it keeps us in business, but I hope they don't. That's I'm hopeful they don't.
Me too. Me
If they
too.
do, we're here. So, okay.
Yeah.
What do you
Uh-huh.
think about that? Generational causes that are unique to each generation for cutoff?
Well, I think Gen X's, and boomers, which that's my generation, we weren't really cutting off parents as much. I mean, there's always been estrangements, but it just wasn't happening in the kind of numbers that it is today. Whereas
Mhm.
millennials and Gen Z, that's where you really see a
Yeah.
big beginning. And part of that is therapeutic culture. But we sort of shifted our emphasis on religion as being kind of the primary determinant of what makes for a good, valuable person. We've ended the idea of honor thy mother and thy father, families forever, respect thy elders, replace it with, is this relationship good for me? Is it bad for me? Is it good for my mental health or is it bad for my mental health? If it's bad for my mental health, then not only should I cut off a parent, but, can I cut off a parent? But I should. And the failure to do that is kind of an act of existential cowardice. So I think that's very true for millennials and Gen Z. I think Gen Z in some ways may be particular risk because they're doing worse than any other generation. They have the
Yeah.
highest rates, right? They have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, actual suicide, and they're going into therapy with so-called trauma informed therapists who assume that every problem that they've got is because of a traumatic background and not recognizing that no, it's because of the phone based childhood, because they're constantly steeped in this toxic brew of downward social comparison where everybody looks smarter and more attractive and more popular. And it's just a terrible thing for them psychologically. I mean, I'd have hated it, and I was spared it being a boomer, but I can't imagine growing up in that kind of environment.
Yeah, well said. So I think with Gen Z, they have to, and because I've seen a lot about this. They, they're in their 20s, some nearing 30. I think the oldest, and I think what has to happen is the same way we tell people who've survived trauma, it wasn't your fault. You have the responsibility though to heal, and there's
Right,
that holding that tension with Gen Z. It wasn't your fault that you grew up in a world of mass marketing messages and the brave new frontier of digital childhood. Because millennials were more digital teens. Like we grew up as
right,
teens, we got hit with it, but
right,
from childhood onward. So for Gen Z, you can grieve the fact that you were taught to hate your parents, hate the opposite sex, hate everything, and you're better, and just buy our product and you'll see everything will be fine. You have to grieve that being pulled out of the matrix that way, but then decide, let's build an adaptive life. And like
right.
when it comes to DBT, the idea of radical acceptance, like it's not fair the
Mhm.
economy is what it is for Gen Z. Not at all. It's not fair when
No,
it was with millennials, when it was the Great Recession. But what do we do
right,
from here? How do we band together and fix it?
right, exactly. Is that a rhetorical question? Because I'm not sure I have the answer for that one
No, no, no.
too.
I was riffing a little bit here, but I do
Yeah,
have another question for you. So, and
yeah.
this is way more open ended. So it'd be interesting to see where it goes. What is something in the psychology world, and this could be estrangement, it could be anything that you think more people need to know?
I think exposure therapy, and you're a trauma specialist, so you know this better than anybody.
I didn't pay him to say this, everybody. Okay.
Because I think when people think, "Oh, I was traumatized," the best thing for me to do is to remove myself from, do everything I can to remove myself from it, and think about it and talk about it all the time. When in fact, those are the least effective things to do. And so many people are being said, "Oh, well, your parent traumatized you. Not only should you cut them off, but it'll be better for your mental health, and you don't have to go back to them until you don't feel triggered again." It's like, well, you're probably going to continue to feel triggered until you actually expose yourself to them and learn how to work through the feelings and reduce the power of them to influence you. So, yeah. So, your thoughts?
I think you stole my answer. I'm kidding. Who's being interviewed? What I would say is spot on, and there's way I call therapy that consists of kind of coffee with a friend, nice,
Right,
informal, unprofessional validation vending, like the validation
right.
vendors. You press a button, like
That's good.
okay,
I
you
like
press
that.
a button,
That's
and
good.
Aetna pays $120. You insert your Aetna card to the vending machine, and then out comes some crisp, fresh validation, and then it's refreshing for like an hour.
Now, did you make that
Thank
up?
you.
You
Yeah,
should write
I
that one
did.
out. You should definitely publicize that one.
Thank you.
If I use
I'll
it, I'll
try.
quote you because I think that's a really good one.
Thank you. I
Validation
truly
vending.
appreciate that.
Yeah,
Alliteration can kind of be helpful. I was like, what is good for validation? Vending. So
vending. Yeah,
basically, it's so important to realize your therapy doesn't need to be like a quick snack, a salty like processed snack because you're going to be hungry for more later. Therapy needs
right.
to evoke change. And,
Yep.
we can say that tenderly to newer therapists because I think the wave of pop psychology influenced therapists who are Gen Z and some millennials are going to think, okay, and I've even seen this in my trainings. I train people in EMDR, and across the years, like the past 5 or so years that I've helped train people, there's more fear that making somebody reprocess the trauma is like we're hurting them. And the way to think of it is
Right.
no, that memory is there. And would you rather them experience the flashback out when they're driving or when we're not there? Or would you rather do a controlled demolition of that,
Yeah.
evoke it, desensitize, and then they're not going to be unpredictably experiencing it in the world?
Right.
That's
Right.
how we
Yep.
have to think about trauma work. It's really resilience work. Like we tell people,
Right.
don't,
I agree.
don't look down. Don't think of a pink elephant. The same principle. I think when we call it trauma informed care, it was nice, but maybe we should call it resilience or growth informed care. Maybe we should
Yeah.
look at where we want to be, not the
Right.
negative thing.
No, I think I could 100% agree. And I think we talked about it in our last interview, but since you specialize in this area, I
Please.
wanted to get more of your thoughts on the whole recovered memories thing. Because my theory about it, is that and it's not I didn't make this up, but I'm in a space who was the people who are critical of the idea, is that it's kind of an extension of Freud's idea that you have a traumatic event and then you repress it because it's so painful, and then maybe it starts kind of leaking into your consciousness. And I really don't think that that's how traumatic events work. It seems to me that I don't know that the mind has the power to repress things at quite that level. I think we could suppress them, but it seems like most people who've had truly traumatic experiences are working really hard to not think about them rather than sort of trying to fight to recover the memory. But what do you think about that?
That's a great question. So, okay, there's conflicting evidence. False memories are real. We know that from the work of Elizabeth Loftus.
By that you mean that they feel real to the person.
They
That's
feel
what you
real
mean,
to the
right?
person.
Right.
Absolutely. So there's
Yeah.
a apparently an article called "The Return of the Repressed" by
Yeah. Have that article.
You've
Yeah.
have you read that? Okay.
I have. Yeah. Yeah.
So the support for repressed memories is somewhat weak. I mean, but it's embedded in clinical beliefs here, clinical practice with many therapists. So, I mean, it's
Right.
not, skeptics are not saying trauma is always remembered. So we have to say that there's a competing body of evidence, and the evidence is across clinical, community, friends, different waves, different camps. So there's some documented abuse survivors later show an inability to recall events. And so I think that's where we need to look is delayed recall memories can appear comparable in accuracy to continuously accessible memories. Okay, it makes case specific corroboration more relevant than blanket claims. So I didn't think about it for years, and then it came back. Can be a real phenomenon. People can have that happen, but it's so we have to be so careful with that
Yeah.
that it's not. There's also reinterpretation instead of recovery. So an event can be
Right.
remembered all along, but the meaning
Right.
changes. Like you might have not experienced something as abuse at the time, but then you reinterpret it that. So essentially, because it's tough to judge from memory to memory. And by the way, with trauma survivors, often what happens is they have the experience, okay, and then it snowballs, and the more they think about it, the more frightening it is, and so affect
Right.
is added to it, and so
Right.
the memory collects steam as a snowball going down the hill, so it changes in quality, and so then
Right.
when we desensitize it, it melts the snowball into the objective fact, and so because memories can change in valence, like meaning and emotional quality, like we're dialing up or down the volume, it's so
Mhm.
difficult to say this is recovered, this isn't, this is real, this isn't. The way EMDR therapy sidesteps that, and I'm sure a lot of desensitization therapy sidestep it, is to say whether or not it happened, let's desensitize that intrusive
Uh,
imagery and get it down, and so that it's like a 0 out of 10, so that it's not haunting you. I mean,
right.
but
I
we have to
agree.
be really careful about that. I am not
Right.
someone who thinks every recovered memory is real. I don't think we can think that, knowing what we do
Right.
about the flexibility and the fallibility of memory.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I just see so many lives ruined, whereas somebody looks like they had a pretty close relationship with a parent, and they're like 30 years old, and then as a result of taking psilocybin or maybe having a psychotic break or something, they have a so-called memory, and the parent just says, "Look, I'll go do a polygraph test. I'll do a psychological battery. I'll go with you to therapy." And the person's like, "No, if I my memory and my bodily feelings, the body keeps the score. That's all I need to know." And I just think it's a serious problem, particularly when they get the authority of a therapist saying, well, you don't have to know more than that to, cut off a parent. So,
Completely agree with you. I think what we have to ask is, how likely is this something that occurred versus like a hazy, kind of dreamed situation? And I'm not discounting trauma survivors. Far from it. I think what we have to say is deal with the emotional and boundary consequences of a memory. So if you have a pattern of parental behavior like grooming, you have, because that's very clear in a lot of the abuse cases, is someone will
mhm,
start within family, very often an uncle or whomever, getting really close and giving you favors, and then quid pro quo to get that abusive adult contact, physical contact. And so obviously follow that, see where that goes if you want to as a patient, and desensitize that. But if you have some hazy thoughts or memories, and somebody asked you something and there was something involved, like, oh, did this happen? Are they implanting something? Because that can happen. So
right, right, right.
it's so nuanced. Like, we're not saying,
It is.
hey, don't feel upset at a parent, and nothing bad happened if you can't perfectly remember it. What we're
Agreed. Yeah.
saying is, hey, be careful with this or making rash decisions one way or the other.
Right. And when I'm a therapist, if I've had the opportunity to work with both the adult child who's saying that something happened and the parent who didn't, I come in saying, "Look, I'm neutral about this. I know that sometimes a parent either has repressed it or is too embarrassed or ashamed to admit it, but also sometimes memories that seem like memories aren't really true. So my goal is to really help the two of you to have a conversation together where you can heal whatever doesn't feel right in the relationship. But that requires a certain amount of bravery on both people, and right, they're not always able to go there.
You're
Yeah,
right. Oh, it
yeah,
absolutely requires bravery and that
yeah.
that differentiation, that ability to say someone's criticism won't destroy me. I mean, and
Right,
also one thing to keep in mind that's an easy thing for our listeners is if someone spontaneously remembers something, that apparently carries no special unreliability according to research. But when therapists started hunting for memories with hypnosis and
right,
guided imagery, suggestive questioning,
right,
and you have these symptoms, so you were abused, that's some
right.
memory implantation stuff, and that's very coercive. I
Yeah,
would just I'll
I
say
agree.
that's unethical to do that,
Totally agree.
even if
Yeah,
you're guided by what you think is good instincts.
right.
Like, when we do no harm, that includes suggesting no harm happen, like, not telling people you have this disorder if we can't show that. So, there
Well, I
that's
think
yeah.
to even extend it along the continuum to more mild cases, I think books that say, well, if you have these kind of symptoms as an adult, you have that kind of a parent, which is just bullshit. You can't predict prior parenting from current functioning. Even an anxiety disorder or even, yeah, severe anxiety disorder or something like that still doesn't mean that a trauma necessarily occurred. It could be purely a biological phenomenon. So, right.
I'm just gonna say, this might be good to clip. We'll see. It'll get a little controversial. I think therapists have to learn to embrace the fact that we don't know everything, and we can look at the medical literature, and I find it fascinating. I used to meet with and have lunch with the psychiatrists when I worked at a bigger clinic because I loved hearing their lens. And so,
Sure.
if we can't say everything is the social science model, everything is nurture. It just
Right.
damages so much to say that because
It's
think about
so
how much
true.
responsibility it puts on people. Like,
Well,
one
right. Yeah.
misstep and you're traumatized.
Right. Exactly.
It's not that way with resilience. It just isn't.
No, and parents think, "Oh, it's 50% nurture, 50% nature."
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got the 50% nurture. No, you don't. You don't have the 50% nurture because it's also siblings, it's also socioeconomic status, it's also peer group, it's also random good luck, it's also cohort, like the
Yeah.
generation you come into.
Go for it.
So parents, I mean, my reading of the research is that parents have maybe can account for 20 to 25% of the variance, but it's not 50%. So parents are important, but not as important as our culture, and particularly therapists today lead them to believe.
There you go. Mic drop on that. I mean, I'm good. We're dispelling myths here. That's one of my big passions. What do you think our society needs to know about the psychology world or our findings or things that you think people don't know as well?
I mean, I just circle back to what you said earlier, Jeremy. I mean, we're
Mhm.
not gods. We're not all knowing. Sometimes hear somebody say, "Oh, you need to go to therapy." It's kind of like, well, you need to find the right therapist and you need to find the right modality for what you're dealing with. Because there's a lot of people in our field who, I mean, I wouldn't refer to myself when I was early in my training. I mean, I think back upon some of the mistakes I made. I'm like, Jesus, my poor clients. I mean, I was well meaning, I was well supervised, but still I was making all kinds of mistakes. I just didn't know enough. I didn't know enough. I hadn't really suffered enough. I hadn't lived enough to really guide people with the kinds of really incredibly important decisions we're entrusted with. And so, I mean, one advice is choose your therapist really, really carefully. Make sure they've had good training or they're referred by multiple people who they've helped. They may have been great for your best friend, but shitty for you. So, I mean, that's probably my biggest message. On the other hand, I'm not down on therapy. I think therapists, I've been in therapy throughout most of my life. I think it can be incredibly healing and transformative and build your resilience and help you make better decisions. But to circle back to one of our earlier points, you don't want a validation vendor. William James wrote that opposition is the truest form of friendship. And in some ways, as therapists, we have to be able to oppose our clients with what they're saying that we don't think is right or good for them, we think that they're fooling themselves. And I think those qualities are equally important.
Man, I'm hung on this. This is big. So, I'm gonna take this from you and credit you and William James. You ever see that the Office episode where it's like Michael Scott steals a Wayne Gretzky quote and like
Uh,
presents it? Obviously you're not doing that. I'm saying, but it's so good. I want to say, okay, this is a quote from William James that
you
Dr.
can.
Coleman said. Right, I'm gonna quote you and him. I mean, because this is
Oh,
such a big showcase of, again, generational differences,
yeah,
quite a few back of, wow, this idea of accountability,
yeah,
opposition is the biggest form of friendship, highest form of friendship. That is massively different than what we hear today, where criticism means someone hates you, like you're
right.
unworthy. I mean, we've totally
Yeah,
bought that wholesale,
yeah,
and it's so sad that if therapists join in on as the cultural priesthood for that, to
Right.
say, actually, that is true. You're not being loved as someone loves themselves. And it's like, well, actually, no. If someone loves themselves well, they're going to know they need to change. If they love themselves
Right.
narcissistically, they're going to think, no growth for me, growth for thee, though. So this
Right.
idea, we need to bring it back. We really need to
Right.
bring back this idea that accountability partners and people who care about your growth care about you.
Right.
Man.
Well, it's related to the fundamental attribution error. For those who don't know that idea, it's the idea that when we think of our own actions, we generally have a much more sympathetic, contextual view of why we did something. But if we're thinking why somebody else did something to us that hurt us, we're just thinking of them as like a bad person. And I see that a lot in the parent adult child kind of dynamics where the adult child says, well, I did this for perfectly good reasons, but you did it because you're a narcissist or a borderline or whatever. Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, no. So I think the accountability factor is high. And I think in my own life, like when I was divorced in my 20s, married and divorced in my 20s, have a kid from that divorce, and I got remarried in my 30s. And we had twins in my second and longstanding current marriage, which is great
Hmm.
now. But there are times in our early years where it was really hard. We had young twin boys and, blended family with my daughter. And, there's times where I thought, well, I'm bailing on this. This is just too damn hard. And my
Hmm.
friends, my close friends, I mean, I had a few friends who were like, yeah, you should, you deserve something better. But a lot of my friends were like, dude, you're doing all kinds of shit that is problematic. So, you're not exactly being the easiest person to live with right now. So, look at your own behavior. And my dad did the same thing, which I really respected. He said, you're also contributing to the problem. So until you can really say you're doing things with a clean slate, and I think it just goes back to the William James quote that you need people who can hold a mirror up to you, not validation vendors. I'm stealing your term, but I'll credit you.
Thank you. Hey, thank you. It's a big honor. Hey, yeah, I appreciate it.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we need that. I mean, it's so important to have that continued growth, and it doesn't stop at a certain age. And it doesn't mean that
Right.
you aren't special. I think this is weird permutation of the trophy participation trophy generation, us millennials, and then that narrative held and stuck, even though it's kind of a joke. And then with Gen
Yeah.
Z, it's kind of turned into something else, and it's rapid time TikTokification of social norms and
Mhm.
essentially the idea that your peers who are telling you you're great and giving you likes and comments that are positive really care about you. And so there's almost this like laundering where I'm making that up on the spot, where it's like
Mhm.
you get your development, your social development through likes and clicks. And so
Yeah.
it's always that affirmation. And if you're not getting affirmation, it means somebody doesn't care. And so this is a big soapbox of mine. I think every time something digital is introduced, like, okay, email, it's just digital mail, or social media, it's just like socializing, but
Yeah.
online. I think it
Right.
actually is a worse version, and I'd love your thoughts on this. This is just off the dome. I've also noticed that it cheapens the real life version because people take these digital metaphors into real life. Like they take the ethics of the digital world back into the real world to I think, catastrophic effect.
Totally. I mean, think about porn used for guys, and then when they actually have a sexual partner, they're expecting them to behave like a porn star. They're behaving like the porn star that they're with, and it's kind of like, wait a second, that's not the way
Yeah.
real life works. And
No.
learning how to again to expose themselves without a sexual sense, but to expose themselves to the real relationships require a certain amount of anxiety working through and tension, and everybody has some degree of social anxiety unless they're just
Yes.
really have like, crazy amygdala or something. It isn't that reactive, but most people have some, and you have to learn how to engage with real people. And yeah, if you're just in the social world, you can completely tailor to fit your neurosis and never expose yourself to the things you actually have to be exposed to.
Yes, yes, we have to desensitize, we have to expose, going back to that principle that more people should know. Okay, so I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit in my question list because I,
Go
I
for it.
want to I want to get into some more estrangement stuff for our listeners. So, how do you see various adult parent couples impacted by estrangement? So, for example, both the married parents are together, adult child cuts them off, or there's divorce that's happened, so parent of the child is with a step parent. Does that affect estrangement? Does that increase it, decrease it? What are your thoughts on those variable couplings and then the adult child estrangement?
Sure. Yeah. Lots to say there. So, I mean, in general, I've developed this saying that, when an estrangement happens, dads get mad and moms get sad. And I think it has to do with the way that men manage anxiety, hurt, shame, etc., through externalization, anger, aggression, violence, drug use, etc. So, a lot of my method is look, if your kids cut you off, you have to figure out why they're doing that, why they think it's the healthiest thing for them to do, make amends, find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth, reach out to them. Moms are like, shit, I'll walk over hot coals to get to my kid. And dads are like,
Yeah.
no, screw that kid. I was a good dad. They can apologize to me. What do I make amends for? And I'm like, well, you can either figure out why your kid is upset with you, or it's that classic saying, you can be right or you can be, in this case, estranged, but you probably can't, you're not going to be able to be right and not be estranged. So there's that division. And I think that has to do with the way that the ideology of motherhood is just much more compelling. The idea that you
Yes.
have to keep trying, that if your kids is suffering, you're suffering, you're not as, you're only as happy as your least happy child. So all those
Mm,
things are incredibly compelling and hurtful to mothers and very confusing to mothers. So that's a common difference. When there's an early reconciliation, it's typically with dad first rather than mother. And if it's a married couple, and I think that has to do with the fact that mothers are generally doing more of the frontline parenting, even if it was an involved father, kids are much more likely to feel enmeshed with mom than with dad. In part because dads don't have as much guilt. They've typically not spent as many hours, but they typically don't have as much guilt about the child or anxiety. So they feel like a less enmeshed member to come back into the family with. But then if there's a divorce, dads are a huge risk, particularly if it's a gray divorce, when the kids are grown, dads are especially at risk of an estrangement, and particularly when they remarry, because when dads remarry, they're more likely to prioritize their new wives, or if they have children with that wife, or that kind of thing. So, yeah, and in my own research, divorce is a huge predictor of estrangement. So it can
mm.
fracture things all the way down the line.
Yeah, people have to be so careful so that their existing children know this doesn't mean
Yeah,
I don't love you anymore. And if that's
right.
mishandled, then that can lead. From my own clinical experience with clients, I know that's a big
Yeah,
predictor of a lot of hurt down the
yeah,
line. And inferiority isn't thinking,
right.
oh, I don't matter as much as the new kids. That's my
Right.
role.
Right, and dads generally aren't really socialized as well to do
Mhm.
the kind of empathic vulnerability work that's really required. So dads often remain estranged because they're not really able to go there and take responsibility and apologize and make amends and that kind of thing. So currently, if this one study is right by Rin Resnick at Ohio State, something like 26% of dads are estranged currently. It's a lot, and
Mm.
they're 22% more likely to be estranged from a daughter. So, all these things matter around when it comes to gender.
Yes. Okay. Well, it's interesting you bring that study up. I'm glad you did. So they created Resnick and colleagues tracked a nationally representative panel and found substantial rates of unestrangement. So reconciliation, sometimes a re-rupture, and then reconciling again. Pillermer's Cornell work found the same. So when an adult child says, I feel better estranged, data suggests this is often a waypoint along a longer arc in their relationship journey. So does that shift how you'd counsel a parent in the acute phase of estrangement then? Should they quietly prepare for a return, hope for one, or set the conditions rather than just brace for permanent loss?
What I tell parents is you need to have one foot in radical acceptance, one foot in hope. The hopeful side is the statistics that you just said. In Resnick's study, 80% of mothers are eventually become reconciled, something like close to 70% of dads. So the vast majority of
Mhm.
these kids do eventually come back to the parent. But radical acceptance, because you can't white knuckle it through life. You can't just say, I can't live again until my child's back in my life, which is a harder sell for most moms than it is for most dads. But the idea that
Mhm.
you still have to get on with your life, you have to find a way to contain it. And that's why radical acceptance, which comes from you were mentioning Marshall Linehan's dialectical behavior therapy,
Yeah.
is such an important thing. I mean, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So the synthesis is I'm going to have pain, but I can also have a good life despite that pain, or in the presence of that pain. So radical acceptance is kind of like saying it is what it is. I mean, I always repeat Linehan's statement that the pathway out of hell is through misery. The more you fight
Yeah.
for misery, the more you stay in hell. And so I think that principle is incredibly important.
Yes. I love Linehan's bluntness. I'm biased and I
Yeah,
appreciate that.
and me too.
So, Gilligan and colleagues found that emotional closeness, more than a big external event like a wedding or a grandchild's birth, predicts whether contact quietly resumes after estrangement. Parents bet on a big event, though. So something like a birth or wedding. The data points towards slow, low stakes warming of the relationship, though. So, have you seen that play out in real time in your work? And how do you redirect a parent pinning all their hope on some wedding invitation or getting to witness the birth of a grandchild?
Well, yeah, I don't know that most of the parents in my practice are pinning their hopes on that. Most of them are more terrified that they're not going to be invited to the wedding. And so our work is a
Yeah.
lot around preparing for that, not being invited to that birth or that wedding or that college graduation or any of those things. But I mean, sometimes they can be, like a birth, a kid might say, adult child might say, well, I really want my parents to have, my children to have grandparents, or their spouse might do that, particularly if they're from another culture, I find. But I think that it's true that the more that parents can kind of set the stage through good communication, becoming more psychological, being willing to make amends. I mean, so many parents say to me, look, if I read your book beforehand, I wouldn't be estranged. And it's not because
Mm,
my book is, I mean, I like my book, obviously I wrote it, but
good
the
book.
basic the main principle is just that, parents can learn when they start to become estranged or distant to actually understand what their child is feeling and experiencing, show curiosity, validate where they can, empathize where they can, take responsibility. If they don't know why, show curiosity and interest and non-defensiveness. I mean, those are the real principles that are going to make a difference if and when an adult child is ready to reconcile.
That makes sense, and that work, it slow and steady is so important. I mean, we probably addressed this last time too, but how do you redirect parents in the meantime to take some of that psychic energy to do something else and not just live in that waiting and in that dread of reconciliation? Especially for moms where the identity was
Yeah.
being a mother.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it is helping them to build self-compassion, to figure out, kind of end the guilt loop in their brains, in the constant self-criticism. I mean, a lot of what's tormenting about estrangement is not just the loss of a child, but it's also the constant guilt, shame, social isolation, withdrawal, and the belief that they don't deserve to continue to have a good life if their child isn't in it. And what I tell parents is, look, you get to say what kind of a parent, or I mean, your kid gets a vote, but you're the CEO of the board in the company in terms of what kind of a parent or person you were. That means you can't. Doesn't mean you should, tell your kid that they're wrong or that sort of thing. But you get to hold on to your idea that you are or were a good parent. You're not obligated to internalize their rejection, but you are obligated to try to understand why they feel like it's the healthiest thing for them to do, because no reconciliation is going to happen without that.
It's so important that people develop their identities across different domains. It doesn't mean you're betraying your kids.
Exactly.
I really would like to hear because we have so many different competing voices in the masculinity therapy space now. Because it's like a void loves to be filled, a vacuum is filled. So for male therapy stuff as a world now, that's so much attention is being spent on that. What would you counsel men to do regarding emotional intelligence development? And I know that's an overused term. So essentially, how to connect better with what their children are feeling. Would you add something different for men? And I don't like to pathologize masculinity when I don't have to. Of course, there's elements just like with femininity. There's elements of anyone's personality that can be quote
Right.
toxic. But I would love to hear your thoughts on where men need to go now in the way that you find best.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to. Yeah, my last article for the Atlantic, I think it was called "What Boys Need." I talked about kind of current parenting pedagogy, and the interesting findings is that not only dads but also mothers talk less to their sons about emotions. They talk to them less, period, but they particularly talk to them less about emotions. They're
Hmm.
much more likely to emphasize, dads in particular, are much more likely to emphasize language around being tough or aggressive or
Hmm.
or whatever. And both are more likely to misinterpret younger boys' upset. So there was an interesting study done where researchers dressed up infant boys as infant girls and vice versa, and then they showed them a video of the child crying. And when they asked parents, what's this child experiencing? The kid who was dressed up as a girl, the infant who was dressed up as a girl, they said, oh, they're experiencing sadness. The boy, they said, oh, he's experiencing anger, even though it was actually a girl. So there's a lot of misattribution that happens happens, boys' psychological their brain development happens at least a month later. Their language
Mhm.
development happens quite a bit later. So helping boys to understand their feelings, to talk to them, to not assume if they're being difficult that they're just trying to be rebellious, but they may be actually expressing a frustration and they actually need you as a parent to kind of be an auxiliary ego and help them to manage their feelings. I think those things are hugely important. Not getting into the whole idea that boys shouldn't cry and have to be tough, and that there's a lot of value in vulnerability and openness and sharing feelings, and also being a good, if you're married, being a good spouse, being a good partner, showing them how you should respond to your partner in a non-aggro kind of a way.
Right. Very well said. So I want to get to this. Your use of the, and I'm going to mess up the names, Doitki and Zilla body in
Yeah.
Estrangement is Purification article. Great article. Everybody should go read it. Makes
Thank
a
you.
point I find fascinating from an evolutionary psychology angle. Okay. So briefly go over it for audience. Their study shows high inequality societies push parents toward anxious, high investment parenting because the
Yeah.
stakes feel existential. Across most of human history, parental investment of that intensity correlated with offspring survival. So that drive is ancient to propel your kids. That modern wrinkle is that that same intensity now gets metabolized by an adult child as intrusion, as helicopter parenting. So do you see estrangement in part as this collision between ancient parental investment instinct and a recent cultural script that reinterprets high investment as tiger mom's helicopter parenting? And if so, how do we help parents walk the line between investment and being overbearing and help kids to see that line as well?
Yeah, no, the study, yeah, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about countries with high social inequality, like here in the UK and China. The
Hmm.
parents have to become tiger moms and helicopter parents because the government and businesses aren't going to do it. It wasn't this
Yeah.
idea that children needed so much investment and care and attention, and that children were so vulnerable, and that if you made a mistake, it was going to later come back to haunt you. The parents could reasonably assume that if they sort of did a decent job, the kids were going to do better than they did. And that was actually true statistically. But boomers were sort of the last generation that could really be the recipient of that kind of optimism. So starting when boomers became parents, that began to recede. So you have that along with play moving indoors, smaller family size. I mean, there's been smaller family sizes for the past century or so, but
Yes.
play moving indoors. So there's been this kind of hothouse family environment. Parents are much more anxious. They're much more guilt ridden. They're much more worried that if they don't parent perfectly, then their kids aren't going to get through the narrow bottleneck to a successful life because they can't count on any kind of governmental or business help in the way that most countries in Europe can, and other countries and say, like Japan can. So parents are understandably anxious. And for some adult children, they just get too much of their parents. They feel too surveilled, too intruded upon. And then you add cell phone use to that, where there's just not enough separation of church and state. So I don't know what the percentage is, but I do know that every single letter from every single adult child says, you need to respect my boundaries. And I think that part of the reason is that the boundaries between parents and children have become very diffuse in ways that they weren't, when I was growing up. My brothers and I talk about, I mean, I didn't particularly have an angry dad, but my brothers and I had this thing of like, my dad's nostrils flared, you knew you better get the hell out of the room because shit was about to go down, right? You didn't have to like yell, you just had to flare. And, you just knew that shit was about to go down, whereas, our our generation, every generation since has been so we don't want to abuse our children, traumatize them. We have to be so conscientious. And it's like that has its own problems because it's kind of been meant the evisceration of parental authority in a certain way.
Yeah. Wow. Well said. So this is a good jump off point. So differentiation, according to Murray Bowen, who I'm a fan of his work,
Me too.
he's an
He's great.
OG in the
He's
field.
an OG. Yeah.
He defined differentiation as staying emotionally connected to your family while functioning as an autonomous self. Okay. So emotional cutoff is the opposite. Looks like independence, but Bowen actually saw it as unresolved fusion. So the person's
Yeah.
so reactive to family's pull that the only way to manage that anxiety to sever contact. So cutoff
Agreed.
differentiation produce opposite outcomes from the same starting point. When you meet an adult child that has gone fully no contact or the parents, how often do you read that situation as being genuine differentiation due to something necessary or just that cutoff in Bowen's terms? What are the telltale signs of a cutoff being emotional avoidance or actually something healthy in your work?
Yeah.
Like,
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one tell is, can that person have other good relationships? You know,
Mhm.
can they have good romantic relationships? Can they have friendships? Can they work? Or is anybody who opposes them become an enemy and they just can't tolerate anybody being different from them? Or in their marriage, are they what I call a cult of one, meaning they've married somebody who they're not, they're just have transferred their lack of differentiation onto the partner. I think that that can be very, very common. I mean, for me, you know, yeah, I'm a fan of Bowen's work too, and I but the model I think is similar to the model for romance. In order to be in a romantic relationship, you have to have the capacity to sort of lose yourself in the other person, that kind of oceanic feeling you get. You know, we talk about how being sexual, or just that feeling of interdependence, where you begin where I end, or vice versa. But you also can't lose yourself in that other person, or you're like psychotic. You have to be differentiated. You have to have the capacity to both be close to that person, but also be separate from that person. And the same is
Yes.
true in the parent adult child relationship. But similarly, the parent has to be differentiated too, because a lot of times estrangements happen because the parent isn't sufficiently differentiated, because they don't have the same kind of friends and hobbies that, my generation of my parents and their generation had. So they're sort of looking for too much closeness and feedback and identity from the children. And the children are like, dude, get your own life. Don't like expect me. This is particularly true in the mother-daughter realm. I'm not trying to be your everything. You need to have other interests. I'll take a certain amount of responsibility for the relationship and your happiness, but I don't want the whole package. And a certain percentage of like even difficult behaviors and attempt to just sort of, wrestle themselves free from that kind of entanglement.
Yes. I think that's a crucial vocabulary dump moment when kids are considering estrangement. I think what they have to recognize is often it is because the parent wants, they have such an identity investment in the child that the child doesn't feel like he or she can do anything without parental, you know, unwarranted, unfound, undesired advice or input.
Mhm.
And I think there's a
Right.
hidden sort of ledger here of, well, I supported you, I brought you into this world, I supported you financially, emotionally. I should have a say in your finished kind of adult product that is you.
Yeah.
And I wonder how our generational narratives on that now among Gen X and boomers differ compared to in previous, cohorts of how much does a parent get to determine how a child turns out and give input that's unsolicited.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I mean, I think it's partially cultural, it's partially generational. Culturally, I think we in the West, and particularly the US, we're the most individualistic society of any society. So, it's much easier, I think, for people in the West to feel like, well, it's really about my own personal happiness and mental health. Whereas in other societies, you know, um, really throughout most of Asia, Latin America, Africa, there's the idea that you're actually a member of a group, of which your family is one of those groups, but there are obligations that you have to that. The other part of it is that, I interviewed the sociologist Joseph E. Davis for my first article in the Atlantic, and he said something I thought was so poetic. He said, when we're raising our children, we do it with the reciprocal bond of kinship in mind, meaning, which is such a great term, meaning that,
Yeah.
it's not a transaction. We're not like, okay, we're raising you and then off you go and, never to see you again. And that's fine as long as you're happy, which is kind of the expectation I feel like I sometimes hear from adult children. Well, I don't owe you anything. I feel like, well, you kind of do. I mean, you owe them at
Hmm.
least an audience for repair. So the reciprocal bond of kinship is that, yeah, you have invested heavily in your child, but there's also the expectation that there's going to be some kind of a bond there. And I think that in many other societies, particularly in Asian societies, there is definitely that expectation, but also in immigrant culture as well. Many immigrants,
Yes.
feel this the same kind of way. So it's sort of a uniquely Western kind of a thing.
It is uniquely Western. So I hope
Yeah.
that we can make it more nuanced into that interdependence. That's that thesis, antithesis, synthesis of, we
Right.
deserve our identities, but also we do make identity in unison with others. And I think Western psychology pivoted a lot away from that. And we could talk about that. But given I'm aware of the time, I thank you for doing this again. This was a lot of fun. Is there something briefly you want to share, like that you're working on or excited for, and what they can where they can catch you, obviously here on Substack?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have a new book coming out in November, Estrangement,
Ooh.
Reconciliation Therapy. It's a book for therapists because a lot of therapists have wanted to know how to do it.
Oh,
People don't know. Yeah, the people don't know about the conference that we're organizing in end of July in Chicago, July 31st. It's called the Summit. It's going to be Carl Pillimer is going to be there. Rutgers researcher Christina Sharp, who does a lot of research on the adult child's experience, marriage therapist Michelle Weiner Davis,
wow.
Rachel Hack, Matthias Barker, Tanya Kazal. So it'll be kind of a who's who of who's writing and researching this area and who's working with adult children and parents. So that should be great. Otherwise, people can just join my Substack, Family Troubles, and also join yours if you're new to Jeremy's work. I recommend him, and we can kind of go
Thank
from
you.
there.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. This was a
My
pleasure. And
pleasure.
yes, everyone,
Yeah.
please feel free to request topics. I do a lot of therapeutic psychoanalytic movie analysis, myths about trauma that we correct with research. And I'm always happy to collaborate and take requests for different subjects. So thank you so much. It's fun
Yeah.
whenever
It's a
we do
pleasure.
this.
Yeah.
Yes. And I will catch
All
you
right.
next time.
Okay. Take care, Jeremy.